The words hit the air like a slap, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the usual airport noise of suitcase wheels rolling and half-hearted conversations. The tension spread fast, like a wave crashing against a quiet shore, pulling more and more eyes toward the scene. People weren't just watching anymore. They were listening. Jake could feel it, the shift in energy, the way conversation slowed, the way strangers who had no reason to care about this interaction were suddenly locked in, waiting for the next move. He lived for this kind of attention. That was the thing about knowing how to push the right buttons. Once you had a crowd, once you had people looking, you had control. And right now, he was in control. Man, I gotta say, he went on, the smirk widening on his face, his voice just loud enough to make sure no one missed a word. Never thought I'd see the day. Iron Man, just hanging out at an airport like the rest of us nobodies. What happened, man? You lose your jet or something? He leaned back in his chair, draping an arm over the seat next to him, taking his time like he was settling in for a good show. His friends chuckled, though one of them looked a little uncomfortable, like maybe this was going a step too far. But Jake didn't care. Robert Downey Jr. had been walking past, minding his own business, dressed in his usual effortlessly cool way, fitted jeans, a vintage t-shirt under a casual blazer, and dark sunglasses that probably cost more than Jake's monthly salary. He had the kind of presence that made people notice him even when he wasn't trying to be noticed. But when he stopped mid-step, slowly removed his sunglasses, and turned to look at Jake, the energy shifted. Jake had expected a dismissive wave, maybe a forced chuckle, or, if he was lucky, some kind of annoyed response that he could twist into another joke. But what he hadn't expected was silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the unsure kind. The kind that felt heavy. Intentional. Like a pause before something big. The people nearby who had been half-watching were fully watching now. Their movements slowed. Their interest sharpened. Even the woman behind the coffee counter had stopped mid-pour, her eyes flicking between them like she was trying to decide whether to intervene or stay out of it. Jake felt that rush, that electric buzz of being at the center of something. He wasn't backing down. I mean, no offense, he added, the fake politeness making it worse. You had a good run. But Hollywood moves on, right? One day, you're on top of the world, and the next, you're just another guy waiting for his flight. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Must be weird, man. Going from being the guy everyone looks up to just old news. The smirk stayed on his face, but even as he said it, something about the way Robert was looking at him made the words feel different. He wasn't annoyed. He wasn't rolling his eyes or getting defensive. He was just watching. Then, without a word, Robert reached over, pulled out a chair from the nearby waiting area, and gestured toward it. Sit, he said. Jake blinked. What? You wanted my attention, Robert said, his voice calm. So sit down. For the first time since the conversation started, Jake hesitated. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The whole point was to get a reaction, to make the other person flustered or irritated or, best case scenario, lash out in a way that would make them look bad. But Robert wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't playing the game. The people around them weren't just watching anymore. They were invested. No one moved. Even the background noise of the terminal seemed muted, like the entire world had narrowed down to this moment. Jake could feel it, the expectation, the pressure. He had two choices, walk away and look like he couldn't handle it, or sit down and prove that he was still the one in control. He scoffed, shaking his head like the whole thing was ridiculous, but he dropped into the chair anyway, arms crossed, the smirk still firmly in place. All right, man. Let's hear it. What? You gonna give me some wise, old man life advice? Robert sat down across from him, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers loosely clasped. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't flustered. If anything, he looked like he had all the time in the world. Do you know why people like you do this? Jake frowned. Do what? Try to make someone smaller so you can feel bigger. Jake scoffed again, rolling his eyes. Oh, come on. It's just a joke. Don't take it so seriously. Robert tilted his head slightly, studying him in a way that made the air between them feel too heavy, too thick. It wasn't a joke, he said quietly. It was an attempt to feel like you matter. The words landed like a brick. Jake blinked, the smirk faltering for just a second before he covered it up with a short, forced chuckle. Dude, what are you even talking about? Robert didn't look away. You thought this was about me? It's not. It never was. His voice was calm, steady, cutting through every ounce of bravado like it wasn't even there. Guys like you don't do this to people you think are beneath you. You do it to the ones you're afraid might be above you. Because if they're not better than you, then maybe you're not as far behind as you feel. Jake's fingers tapped against his arm, restless, a small movement that no one but Robert seemed to notice. You ever notice that the happiest, most secure people don't do what you just did? Robert went on, voice still even, still quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear. They don't need to. Because when you're actually happy with yourself, you don't go looking for people to tear down. You lift others up. You recognize that someone else's success doesn't take anything away from you. The words pressed into Jake's chest, heavy, like something he had been avoiding for a long time had just been laid bare for everyone to see. He wanted to argue. He wanted to laugh it off. He wanted to say something, anything, that would shift the power back into his hands. But for the first time, he had nothing. The silence stretched between them. Robert studied him for a second longer, then finally leaned back, exhaling softly, shaking his head almost like he felt sorry for him. I get it, he said. I've been you before. I spent years thinking the world was out to get me, that tearing people down was the only way to keep myself from sinking. But you know what I learned? Jake didn't answer. Robert pushed back his chair, standing up, slipping his sunglasses back on. You're only as small as you choose to be. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Jake sat there, hands clenched against his knees, the smirk long gone, the laughter from his friends strangely absent. He didn't move. He didn't speak. And as he sat there, surrounded by strangers who had all just watched him lose at a game he thought he had mastered, something inside him shifted. Something he wasn't ready to name. Jake sat there, gripping the edge of the chair like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The airport noise crept back in, a sharp contrast to the silence that had just filled the space around him. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, people shifted, moved along, but not without sneaking one last glance in his direction. Some still had their phones out, recording, whispering to one another, probably already posting about what had just happened. He felt the heat of their eyes, the weight of something unspoken pressing against his chest. His friends were quiet, unusually so, the usual laughter missing, the air around them thick with something he didn't know how to name. He could still see Robert walking away, shoulders relaxed, not once looking back. The man hadn't tried to embarrass him, hadn't raised his voice or turned it into a spectacle, but somehow that was worse. That quiet, steady gaze had stripped Jake down in a way no public humiliation ever had. He had expected a sharp remark, a witty comeback, something that would turn the moment into a game he could still win. But instead, he had been handed a truth so raw it had left him defenseless. He wanted to be angry, to call it ridiculous, to shake off the discomfort creeping up his spine, but the words Robert had left behind wouldn't leave his head. You're only as small as you choose to be. Something about those words lodged itself deep, like a splinter he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. He swallowed, forcing out a laugh, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. Man, what was that? Guy thinks he's some kind of philosopher now. His voice was forced, a little too loud, but his friends just exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. The laughter he had been expecting didn't come. One of them, the one who had chuckled earlier, shifted uncomfortably. I mean, you kinda started it. His tone was cautious, like he wasn't sure how Jake would react. Jake's jaw tensed. It was a joke. Another one, the quietest of the group, sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, but you kept pushing. And then he trailed off, shaking his head. Jake scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, forcing a smirk. Come on, you guys are acting like he said something deep. He just flipped it around, that's all. It's a classic move, like Psychology 101. He shrugged, reaching for his drink, taking a slow sip like he wasn't bothered, like his pulse wasn't hammering in his ears. I don't care what some washed-up actor has to say about me. No one responded. He hated the silence more than anything. The way they weren't agreeing with him, weren't laughing, weren't feeding into the image he had built for himself. It was subtle, but it was there, the shift in the way they were looking at him. Like something had cracked. One of them checked his phone, eyes flicking across the screen before he let out a short breath. Dude, people are already posting about it. He turned the screen toward Jake, and there it was, videos popping up on social media, people commenting, dissecting the moment. Some were praising Robert for handling it the way he had. Others were tearing into Jake, calling him pathetic, insecure, a wannabe bully who had just been put in his place. The comments were endless, new ones flooding in by the second. Jake's stomach twisted. Who cares? He waved it off, but his fingers curled tightly around the edge of his chair. Another friend hesitated before speaking. You do, though. Jake's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? The guy shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I mean, if you really didn't care, you wouldn't be trying so hard to act like it doesn't bother you. Something cold settled in Jake's chest. He forced out another laugh, shaking his head. Wow, all right. So now we're psychoanalyzing me? Yes, hanging around Mr. Self-Help Guru rubbed off on you guys. He stood abruptly, grabbing his bag, needing to move, to get away from this conversation before it suffocated him. Whatever, man. I don't need to sit here and listen to this. One of them sighed but didn't stop him. Jake turned, walking toward the gate, head high, shoulders squared, pretending he wasn't hearing the whispers, the glances, the muted buzz of people still talking about him. But the thing about pretending was that it only worked if you could convince yourself to. And right now, he wasn't sure he could. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, already dreading whatever new notification had popped up. It was worse than he thought. Someone had posted the full video with the caption, "Man publicly mocks Robert Downey Jr. What happens next leaves everyone speechless." The views were skyrocketing. The comments kept coming. He could ignore them. He could block it out. But even as he told himself that, he knew it wasn't true. Because the worst part wasn't what Robert had said. The worst part was that deep down, in a place he had spent years trying to ignore, he knew the man had been right. Jake sat in the airport lounge, staring at his phone screen, his fingers twitching slightly as he scrolled through the endless flood of comments. Every few seconds, the number of views ticked higher, the video spreading faster than he could keep up with. He told himself he didn't care, that it was just another moment people would talk about for a few days before moving on to the next viral thing. But the words burned every time his eyes landed on another notification. Dude got humbled in 4K. Imagine trying to roast RDJ and getting psychoanalyzed instead. This is why some people shouldn't open their mouths in public. The comments weren't just laughing at what happened, they were laughing at him. His jaw tightened as he flicked through the endless opinions being thrown his way, people dissecting his every word, his body language, his reaction. They had turned him into a joke, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to flip it back in his favor. Normally, he could twist things, spin them into something funny, make himself look like he had been in on it the whole time. But this? There was no joke here. There was no way to rewrite what had happened. Robert hadn't yelled, hadn't insulted him, hadn't made a scene. He had just looked at him, seen right through him, and said things that Jake couldn't shake, no matter how much he wanted to. He slammed his phone face down on the table and leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. His friends were still sitting a few feet away, but they weren't saying much. The energy between them had shifted, and he hated it. They weren't laughing. They weren't making jokes. They weren't even looking at him the same way. He could feel it, that unspoken judgment, the way they had seen something today they weren't sure they could ignore. One of them finally spoke, voice careful. "Are you going to say anything?" Jake scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do you want me to say?" The guy hesitated before answering. "I don't know, man. Maybe something that doesn't make you sound like this was just another joke to you." Jake's shoulders tensed. "What's that supposed to mean? You're acting like this doesn't bother you." Jake let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "And what? You think it does? You think I care what some washed-up actor thinks about me? Come on, man. It's not that deep." The guy gave him a long look, then glanced at the phone Jake had slammed onto the table. "Yeah? Then why are you still checking the comments?" Jake clenched his jaw but didn't answer. Another one of them shifted in his seat, looking at Jake with something different in his expression, something that made his stomach twist. "Dude, I've known you for years, and I've never seen you like this. If it really wasn't a big deal, you wouldn't be sitting here, acting like you're fine when we all know you're not." Jake rolled his eyes, but his chest felt tight. "Jesus, now you guys are all therapists too? What, did I sign up for some intervention without realizing?" No one laughed. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. One of them sighed, shaking his head. "You know what, man? Forget it." They stood, grabbing their bags, and just like that, they were leaving. Jake blinked, his frustration turning into something else, something he didn't want to name. "Wait, what? Where are you guys going?" One of them paused, giving him a look that wasn't angry, wasn't even disappointed. "Just tired. We got a flight to catch. You should probably stop sitting here pretending this didn't happen and figure out why it's bothering you so much." And then they walked away. Jake sat there, jaw locked, hands clenched into fists against his knees. He wanted to yell after them, to say something that would bring things back to normal, that would make them stop looking at him like that, like something had changed. But nothing came. His phone buzzed again. Another comment. Another reminder. Another weight pressing down on him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure how to carry it. Jake stepped outside the terminal, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets as he took in the airport drop-off area, the air crisp against his face. People came and went, taxis pulling up, drivers slamming trunks shut, travelers dragging their luggage in all directions. Everything around him moved fast, but he felt stuck, like the world had shifted just enough to throw him off balance, and he was the only one who noticed. He had no idea where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay inside, not with the weight of all those eyes on him, not with the words still ringing in his head. His phone vibrated again. Another notification. Another reminder that this wasn't going away. He clenched his jaw, pulling it out, telling himself it was nothing, that he didn't care. But the second he unlocked the screen, the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. The video had already passed 1 million views. The comments were endless, people tearing him apart, some laughing at him, others dissecting every moment, every word, every expression. This dude thought he was going to clown our DJ and got his whole life read like an open book. The way he just sat there when Robert was done with him, priceless. You can literally see the moment he realizes he's the joke. His grip tightened around his phone, his pulse hammering. He should have expected this. It was the internet. People loved a public takedown, loved a villain, loved to watch someone fall. But knowing that didn't make it easier to swallow. He scrolled faster, past memes, past people analyzing his reaction frame by frame, past videos of others reacting to the clip, laughing at his expense. And then, mixed in with the flood of mockery, something caught his eye. A comment, buried beneath the chaos. "I don't even think this guy is a bad person. He just looks lost." Jake stared at it, his stomach twisting. It was stupid, just some random person's opinion, nothing more. But it made something inside him tighten in a way he didn't like. He was used to being called an idiot, a jerk, an arrogant prick. None of that ever got to him. But lost? That was different. That was too close to something real, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Rough day. The voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up and saw the same airport worker from earlier standing a few feet away, a disposable coffee cup in one hand, his other tucked casually into his jacket pocket. The man wasn't looking at him with pity or judgment, just quiet curiosity, like he already knew the answer but was giving Jake the chance to say it himself. Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "What, you following me now?" The man smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Nah, just on my break." Jake rolled his eyes and leaned back against a pillar, stuffing his phone back into his pocket. "Well, congrats. You found me. You got more wisdom to drop, or can I just stand here in peace?" The man didn't react to the hostility. He just took another sip of his coffee, watching the steady flow of traffic pass by. You know, when people say they don't care, they usually say it too many times. Jake clenched his jaw. "Yeah? And what's that supposed to mean?" The man shrugged. "Means if you really didn't care, you wouldn't be out here checking the comments every 5 seconds. Jake exhaled through his nose, his fists curling in his pockets. "Jesus, do you just go around reading people like this? Or am I just special?" The man chuckled. "Nah, just been around long enough to recognize someone who's trying too hard to act like nothing bothers him." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe I just think the whole thing is stupid." The man nodded, considering. "Could be. Or maybe you're realizing that for the first time, the joke's on you, and you don't know how to handle it." Jake flinched before he could stop himself. The man saw it, but he didn't push. He just leaned against the railing, the steam from his coffee curling into the cold air. "You know, people don't talk about the other side of being the guy who always gets the last word," he said. "They don't talk about what happens when someone finally takes that power away." Jake swallowed, looking away. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man smirked. "Yeah, you do." Jake hated how certain he sounded, like he already knew exactly what was going on in his head, like he had seen 100 guys just like him before. He hated that, for once, he didn't have a comeback ready, nothing sharp or clever to throw back. His phone vibrated again. He ignored it. The man straightened, finishing the last sip of his coffee. "Look, kid, I don't know you. I don't know your life, don't know what's got you wired this way. But I do know this. When something sticks with you this much, when you can't stop thinking about it, there's usually a reason. And maybe, just maybe, that reason isn't about Robert Downey Jr. at all." Jake's stomach twisted again, but he forced out another scoff. "Right. Thanks for the therapy session. Real helpful." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourself." He tossed the empty coffee cup into a nearby trash can, turning to head back inside. "But I'd think about it if I were you. 'Cause if you don't, trust me, this isn't the last time it's gonna happen." Jake watched him go, his hands still clenched in his pockets, his mind racing. He didn't want to think about it. He wanted to move on, to shake it off, to prove to himself and everyone else that none of this mattered. But as he pulled out his phone again, his eyes drifting back to that one comment buried under the flood of insults and jokes, he realized something that made his chest tighten even more. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just afraid of what it meant if Robert had been right. Jake stood outside the airport, the cold air biting at his skin, his phone still buzzing in his pocket. He didn't want to look at it anymore, didn't want to see another comment, another reminder of how the entire world had just watched him crumble in real time. The conversation with the airport worker stuck in his head more than he wanted to admit, his words digging deeper than they had any right to. When something sticks with you this much, there's usually a reason. He hated how much that line bothered him, how much it made sense in a way he didn't want to face. His friends had walked away, the internet had turned against him, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to tell him he had won. The automatic doors slid open behind him, and a few travelers stepped out, their voices blending into the hum of the city beyond the terminal. He had nowhere to go, no flight to catch, nothing to do but stand there and think about how he had ended up here. He wasn't sure how long he stood like that, arms crossed, staring at the ground like it had answers, before a new voice cut through the noise. Figured you'd still be out here. Jake looked up sharply, and for a second, he thought his mind was messing with him. Robert Downey Jr. stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. Jake felt his entire body tense up, every muscle locking in place. He had spent the last hour trying to convince himself that what had happened inside wasn't a big deal, that it wasn't getting to him, and now here was the man who had started it all, standing right in front of him like the universe wasn't done with him yet. Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You serious? You following me now? Robert smirked slightly but didn't move. Nah, just passing through. Jake scoffed, looking away. Yeah, well, if you're here to drop some more wisdom, save it. I'm not in the mood. Robert didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked almost amused, like he had seen this kind of reaction before. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away, giving Jake enough space to walk away if he wanted to. You're taking this pretty hard for someone who doesn't care. Jake clenched his jaw, fingers twitching at his sides. Man, can everybody stop saying that? Robert shrugged. Then stop acting like it's true. Jake inhaled sharply, trying to keep the frustration from boiling over. What do you want, man? Seriously. You already won, okay? You got your moment. Everybody thinks you're some kind of genius, and now I'm the punchline. What more do you want? Robert studied him for a second before answering. You think this was about winning? Jake let out a bitter laugh. Wasn't it? You saw an opportunity to make me look like an idiot, and you took it. Congratulations. Robert shook his head. You did that all on your own. Jake's stomach twisted, but he refused to let it show. Right. Whatever. Robert sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like he was deciding whether or not to keep talking. Eventually, he did. You know, I wasn't always the guy people see now, he said, voice even. I was a mess. Said the wrong things, hurt the wrong people, thought I had it all figured out when I didn't know a damn thing. And every time I screwed up, I told myself the same thing you're telling yourself right now, that none of it mattered, that people just didn't get me, that it wasn't my fault. Jake didn't respond, but his throat felt tighter than before. Robert continued, tone calm but direct. The problem with that mindset is that it doesn't change anything. You stay stuck, always looking for the next moment to prove you're the smartest guy in the room, always needing to be the one in control. And eventually, people stop giving you chances. They stop caring. And then you look around, and you realize you've got nothing left but your own excuses. Jake swallowed, his pulse loud in his ears. Robert let the words settle before speaking again. You're not the first guy to think being the loudest person in the room makes you the most important. And you won't be the last. But sooner or later, you have to ask yourself what you're actually getting out of it. Jake's fingers curled into fists. You don't know me, man. Robert nodded. You're right. I don't. He tilted his head slightly. But I recognized you the second you opened your mouth back there. 'Cause I've been you before. Jake looked away, jaw tight. Yeah? And what? You magically figured it all out one day. Robert huffed a quiet laugh. No. I lost everything first. Jake glanced at him, frowning. Robert nodded. Friends, career, respect. You name it. I lost it. And the worst part? I didn't even see it happening. I was too busy convincing myself that everyone else was the problem, that I was the one who had it all figured out. His voice dropped slightly. You don't get to be the smartest guy in the room when you're the only one left in it. Jake's chest felt tight again, like something was pressing down on it. He wanted to snap back, to throw out some sarcastic remark, but for the first time, he had nothing. Because as much as he wanted to deny it, something about what Robert was saying felt too close, too familiar, like someone had just pulled the curtain back on something he had spent years trying not to see. Robert exhaled, glancing toward the street where a black car was pulling up. He looked back at Jake one last time. You can keep playing the part if you want. Keep pretending none of this matters, that you don't care what people think, that everything's just a joke. He gave a small shrug. Or you can decide to be better. Up to you. The car door opened, but Robert didn't get in right away. He just stood there for a moment, waiting, giving Jake a chance to say something. But Jake didn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Robert studied him for another second, then nodded slightly, like he had already known this was how it would end. Without another word, he slid into the car, the door shutting behind him. Jake stood there, his hands still in his pockets, his mind racing, his heart hammering. He didn't move, didn't look at his phone, didn't do anything but stand there, staring at nothing. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt completely, painfully quiet.